She sat across from her mother at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning, holding a cup of coffee with both hands, the steam rising gently between them. Her mother was crying softly, the way older women cry when the grief is too large for any other expression. Silently, with her whole body still, only the tears moving. The woman across the table reached over and took her mother's hand and said, "I'm here, Mama. I'm right here. It's going to be all right." And Gloria Carter looked at the woman sitting across from her, the woman with her daughter's face and her daughter's hands and her daughter's voice. And she did something that she would not fully understand for months afterward. She said thank you. She squeezed the hand that was holding hers. She believed it. She had no reason not to believe it. The woman across that table was her daughter, except she wasn't. Her real daughter had been buried in the Georgia woods for 63 days, and the woman holding her hand was the person who put her there. That is where this story ends. But to understand how it got there, to understand how a woman can sit across a kitchen table from her own mother, in her own sister's house, wearing her sister's face like a garment she has spent years tailoring to fit, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a two-bedroom brick house on a street in southwest Atlanta where two identical girls grew up in the same bed and wore the same face and breathed the same air, and where everything seemed equal between them until it wasn't. You have to understand what it means to look in the mirror your entire life and see someone else. What it does to a person over time. What it builds in the dark, slowly, across 30 years, when nobody is paying close enough attention to catch it before it is too late. This is that story, and I need you to stay with me, because it is one of the most disturbing things I have ever had to tell here at the moment. Cascade Heights is a neighborhood in the southwestern quadrant of Atlanta that most people outside Georgia have never heard of, and that most people inside Georgia understand in a way that requires no explanation. It sits below the noise of the city's more famous districts, below Buckhead and Midtown and Little Five Points, quietly, without the kind of attention that comes from being considered remarkable. But the people who come from Cascade Heights carry it the way people carry the places that formed them, in their spines, in their standards, in the particular quality of their dignity that has nothing to do with what they own and everything to do with how they were raised. It is a neighborhood where people cut their lawns on Saturday morning and go to church on Sunday and know each other's names and have been knowing each other's names for long enough that the knowing is not effort but habit. It is the kind of neighborhood that does not make the news unless something goes wrong. In August of 2016, something went deeply and irreversibly wrong. Gloria and Raymond Carter had lived on Danner Drive in Cascade Heights since 1979, the year they married. The house was a three-bedroom brick ranch with a carport and a chain-link fence around the backyard, and a kitchen that faced east, so the morning light came in across the counter while Gloria cooked. Raymond had saved for 3 years before the wedding, setting aside a fixed amount every week from his city bus driver's salary into a coffee can he kept at the back of his closet. Not a savings account, not an investment, a coffee can, because a savings account has minimums and fees and paperwork, and a coffee can has nothing except your discipline and your intention, and Raymond Carter had both of those things in full. Gloria always said that a man who saves before he spends understands tomorrow. Raymond Carter understood tomorrow the way very few people do. Not as an abstraction, but as a daily practice, a commitment renewed every single week. When he opened that closet and put the money in. They tried for children for 4 years before Gloria became pregnant in the spring of 1981. The pregnancy was hard from the beginning. High blood pressure, 2 hospital visits in the second trimester, a bed rest instruction that the doctor gave, and Gloria largely ignored because the bills did not take bed rest into consideration and continued, arriving on their own schedule regardless. But on the evening of November 3rd, 1981, at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, the same hospital where Gloria would eventually work double shifts as a licensed practical nurse for 23 years, Gloria Carter delivered 2 daughters. The first arrived at 7:43 in the evening. The second arrived at 7:54, 11 minutes between them. Gloria named the first one Serena. Raymond named the second one Simone. He said the names sounded like music together. Gloria looked at both of them in the same moment. 2 identical faces, Two sets of identical eyes blinking in the hospital light, and she said they sounded like trouble. She was right about both things. From the earliest age, anyone who spent more than an afternoon with both girls understood that identical was a word that described their faces and very little else. Serena was focused in the way that some children simply are, not because anyone demanded it of her, not because the household created pressure, but because her nature ran toward completion the way water runs toward the lowest point. She finished things. She made her bed every morning from the time she was 6 years old without being asked once. She kept a small notebook of words she did not know, so she could look them up in the dictionary later, and when she had looked them up, she used them in sentences until they belonged to her. She read ahead in her school books. She sat at the front of every classroom not because she wanted to be seen, but because she wanted to hear everything. Her grandmother Evelyn, a woman from Valdosta who had survived enough to have earned her particular kind of wisdom, said that Serena was born with direction, that some people spend their whole lives searching for a reason to get up in the morning, and some people arrive already knowing. Serena, she said, came in already knowing. Simone was not a lesser child. That needs to be said clearly, because this story is not the story of a brilliant sister and a dim one. It is the story of two capable women and the distance that opened between them over 30 years, and why that distance became what it became. Simone had gifts that Serena did not have in the same measure. She was socially brilliant in a way that is genuinely rare. She could walk into a room full of strangers and come out 20 minutes later with three new friends and detailed knowledge about all of them. She was funny in the specific way that makes people feel good about themselves rather than at someone else's expense. She remembered birthdays. She knew how to make a difficult conversation feel manageable. Teachers liked Serena because she made their jobs easier. They liked Simone because she made their days lighter. Both girls were loved. Both girls were capable. But Simone had a problem that nobody identified clearly enough or early enough, and that problem was this. She had never learned to measure herself by her own yardstick. From as early as anyone could remember, the only measure Simone Carter used for her own life was the measure of her sisters. Gloria saw it first, the way mothers see the things that everyone else is still looking past. She talked to Raymond about it on Sunday evenings after the girls were asleep. The particular quiet of late Sunday nights, in a house where the children are finally still. She told him she was worried that Simone was building a measuring stick out of Serena that would never be long enough, because the wood it was made of was wrong. Raymond said Simone would grow out of it. Most children who compare themselves to siblings eventually find their own footing. Gloria said she hoped he was right. She lit extra candles at Cascade United Methodist Church on Sunday mornings. She prayed specific prayers for Simone, not that God would make her more like Serena, because that prayer would only deepen the problem, but that he would show Simone what her own life was worth on its own terms, that he would give her daughter the thing that Serena seemed to have arrived in the world already carrying. That prayer, for reasons that would not reveal themselves until August 2016, was never fully answered. The girls graduated from Frederick L. Stanton Elementary and moved on to middle school and high school and carried their identical faces through the years, the way twins who have grown up with the confusion tend to carry it. With practiced patience, correcting people without irritation, occasionally using the confusion as a shared joke on the evenings, it seemed funny. They were close in the way that twins who have shared everything from birth are close, with the particular intimacy of people who have never known a version of the world that did not include the other person. But beneath that closeness, in the specific architecture of Simone's relationship to Serena, the measuring never stopped. When Serena was named to the honor roll, Simone checked her own grades against it. When Serena was selected for the gifted academic program, Simone asked her mother twice in 1 week whether she could be tested for it too. When Serena was chosen to speak at their 8th grade graduation, and Simone was not, Simone sat in the third row in a yellow dress and applauded with both hands and smiled throughout. But if you had been watching closely enough, in the fraction of a second after the applause ended, you would have seen something underneath that was not pride and not jealousy in the ordinary sense. It was something quieter and more patient, something that had already at 13 years old decided to wait. By the time the Carter twins enrolled at Spelman College in Atlanta in the fall of 1999, they had grown into young women who were, to the untrained eye, almost indistinguishable. Same height, 5'6", same deep brown complexion, same wide-set dark eyes, same full mouth. The differences their family read instantly, the slight variation in the set of their jaw, the way Serena's left eye sat marginally higher, the small scar at the base of Simone's chin from a bicycle accident, were invisible to most people encountering them for the first time. But by the time they were sophomores, something had happened between them that went beyond facial similarity and had to do with the divergence of their trajectories, a divergence that was becoming harder and harder to ignore if you were the person on the lesser side of it. Serena thrived at Spelman in a way that was impossible to overlook. She made the dean's list every semester from her first to her last. She secured a summer internship at an Atlanta accounting firm in her sophomore year and came back in the fall with a job offer already waiting for her at graduation. She was elected vice president of the Business Students Association in her junior year. Her professors began recommending her for fellowships and mentorship programs that required faculty endorsement. Her name began circulating in small but important ways in the networks that Spelman women build during their years on campus. She was, by every measure that mattered, doing exactly what she had come to do, in exactly the way she had planned to do it, on exactly the schedule she had set for herself. Simone graduated in the middle of her class. Her marketing degree was legitimate and earned without shortcuts, and represented genuine competence in her field. She returned to Atlanta to a position at a mid-sized PR firm called Meridian Communications in Midtown, where she would be promoted twice in her first 4 years and eventually manage a small team and receive annual performance reviews that her supervisor, a woman named Denise Ware, characterized as strong and occasionally exceptional. From the outside, Simone Carter was doing fine. By most objective measures, she was doing more than fine. But Simone Carter had never once, in her 30-plus years on Earth, evaluated her own life by any honest accounting. She had only ever evaluated it against Serena's. And Serena's life, by the time both women were in their late 20s, was no longer merely fine. It was exceptional. It was building into something that had a shape Simone recognized, and that shape was the shape of everything she had told herself she was going to have. Serena met David Webb at a charity gala for the Atlanta Community Food Bank in the spring of 2009 and understood within 30 minutes that was different from the men she had been meeting at events like this one. He was 32 years old. He had built Webb and Associates from a one-room operation in a College Park apartment into a real estate development firm with 2 completed Midtown projects and a third in early groundbreaking. He was not the kind of man who arrived in a room and announced himself with volume or performance. He was the kind of man who listened when you talked, genuinely listened, not the social performance of listening while composing your next sentence, and who remembered 3 weeks later what you had said. Serena noticed that quality within 20 minutes, and she had enough experience with the performance of it to recognize the real version. They talked for 2 hours at that gala. He asked for her number at the end of the night. She gave it to him. They dated for 2 years with the patience of 2 people who have worked hard enough and waited long enough to know the difference between wanting something quickly and wanting something correctly. He proposed in November 2010, not at a restaurant, not at a scenic overlook, not at any location chosen for its photographability. He proposed in the backyard of the house on Danner Drive in Cascade Heights, with Gloria and Raymond watching from the kitchen window and the yard smelling the way South Atlanta yards smell in November, like cut grass going, dormant, and the particular Atlanta air that does not feel like autumn anywhere else. Simone was there, standing off to one side in a heavy coat with her arms folded across her chest. Serena said yes before the sentence was complete. She cried the way people cry when something they have been working toward for a long time finally arrives. Not with surprise, but with relief. And Simone stood to one side with her arms folded and smiled. And everyone who was watching thought, what a beautiful moment. And only one person in that yard was watching something other than the moment itself. The wedding was everything that Cascade Heights expected of a Carter daughter, and everything that the community deserved. Cascade United Methodist Church on a Saturday afternoon in October 2011. 400 guests. Catering by Miss Althea, who had been feeding that community at every significant occasion for 30 years, and whose food carried in it the specific language of celebration that the neighborhood understood in the way only food made by someone who knows exactly who they are feeding can be understood. The DJ played Kirk Franklin and then Earth, Wind, and Fire, and then slid into old school rhythm and blues until the older relatives were on the floor and the younger ones were recording it. Reverend Clarence Moss performed the ceremony with the warmth of a pastor who has known a family for 20 years and believes completely in what he is doing. It was the kind of wedding that gets talked about in a community for years, not because of what it cost, but because of what it said, what it meant, because of what Serena Carter had built and who she had built it with, and how visibly, how completely, the life she had promised herself had arrived. And Simone Carter stood at that altar in a dusty rose gown and held her sister's bouquet and smiled a smile that the entire room read as joy. David and Serena moved into their home on Magnolia Crest Drive in Buckhead 6, months after the wedding. It was a 4-bedroom house in one of Atlanta's most sought-after neighborhoods. Not the largest house on the street, not the most expensive, but theirs, fully and completely theirs. Serena made it a home the way only a woman raised in Cascade Heights could make a home, with intention and care, and the specific aesthetic dignity that comes from understanding what a home is supposed to do for the people inside. She painted the front door a deep burgundy that became a neighborhood landmark. She filled the foyer with plants and fresh-cut flowers she changed every 2 weeks. She turned the formal dining room into a room where actual meals were eaten by actual people. The neighbors welcomed them the way Buckhead's Black professional community tends to welcome people who have earned their place, with warmth and with the unspoken recognition that presence here is a form of testimony whether you intend it to be or not. By 2013, Serena Carter Webb was 31 years old and living the life she had promised herself in the backyard of the house on Danner Drive. When she was young enough that the promise felt enormous, she was in Buckhead with a husband who loved her and a career that was building towards something with her name on it, and a home that people talked about for the warmth of it, and a community that she had genuinely earned. She was happy in the complete sense, not the performed version of happiness that substitutes for the thing itself, but the actual thing, the version you arrive at after years of decisions made correctly and maintained through difficulty. She was genuinely, entirely happy, and her twin sister, in a nice apartment in Sandy Springs, had been watching every step of it. And by 2013, watching had shifted into something that had a different name. To understand what Simone Carter became, you have to understand what Simone Carter was, and you have to be willing to sit with the distance between those two things, because that distance is where this entire story lives. Simone was not a bad person in the way that people who do terrible things are sometimes not bad people, not broken from birth, not warped in some traceable, identifiable way that you could point to in childhood and say, there, that is where the damage was done. She was a woman with genuine gifts she had never learned to trust, and a hunger she had never learned to name, and the combination of those two things, fed by proximity to the one person she could not stop measuring herself against, over the course of 3 decades, produced something that ended in a grave outside Lithonia and a courtroom in Fulton County. Simone was not a lesser student at Spelman. Her marketing degree was earned honestly and with real competence. Her supervisor at Meridian Communications, a woman named Denise Ware, described her in performance reviews across 4 years as one of the most strategically minded people on the team. Denise Ware was called to testify about Simone's character at the 2018 trial. She spent a long time looking at the floor before she answered the first question. Simone's apartment in Sandy Springs was immaculate. Her wardrobe was considered. She had friends she maintained with genuine warmth and a social fluency that Serena, for all her focused brilliance, did not quite possess in the same way. Simone walked into a gathering of strangers and came out 20 minutes later with 3 new friends and information about all of them. She was, by any honest external accounting, a woman doing reasonably well. But Simone had a mirror problem from the time the Carter girls were old enough to understand comparison. Simone measured herself not against her own potential, but against Serena. Always. Without exception, without rest. The apartment in Sandy Springs was nice by any reasonable standard. The career at Meridian was solid. The relationship she entered in 2011 with a financial analyst named Andre Tillman was with a steady, reliable man who showed up when he said he would and treated her with a consistent decency that is, by any adult accounting, more valuable than most things people mistake for love in the dramatic and temporary sense. But Andre Tillman was not David Webb. He was not building a company. His apartment was comfortable, not notable. His income was reliable, not impressive. And Simone, who had begun applying the same comparative calculus to every dimension of her personal life, found herself measuring Andre against David Webb. And the result of that measurement made her restless in a way she could neither explain nor manage. Andre noticed. He told his sister in early 2014 that Simone seemed like she was somewhere else even when she was physically present. He ended the relationship in 2015. Simone told Serena about the breakup on a Sunday evening phone call and cried with genuine grief. And Serena, because Serena was Serena, told her to come stay for a while. She had a guest room and a full kitchen and as much time as Simone needed. Simone said yes. She had been waiting for exactly that invitation. The composition notebook, recovered years later from the back of a closet in Simone's Sandy Springs apartment, was dated from 2013. It contained 43 pages of observations written in pencil, organized by category. The coffee order, medium roast, no sugar, a splash of oat milk, always a splash, not a pour. The perfume, amber and jasmine, from a boutique on Peachtree Road called Ariel's, ordered every 3 months, never substituted. The route Serena drove to her mother's house every Sunday, I-285 south to Cascade Road, even when the traffic app suggested alternatives, because Serena had driven that route her entire adult life and it felt like coming home. The banking passwords, obtained during a medical scare when Serena had needed Simone to handle a remote transfer and had shared them without thinking twice, because she trusted her sister with everything. The pin from an address book in the nightstand. The signature, 40 practice iterations, written on pages that were later torn out and destroyed. This was not the behavior of a woman going through a difficult season. This was the behavior of a woman who had decided what season was coming next and was preparing for it with the full commitment of someone who had been thinking about nothing else for years. The first visit to the Buckhead house in the spring of 2012 lasted a weekend. Simone arrived on a Friday evening with an overnight bag and a bottle of wine and the familiar ease of a sister coming to stay, and she left on a Saturday afternoon with something she had not arrived with. A mental dialogue of the house that was more thorough than any guest had, a reason to compile. She knew the layout of every room. She knew which cabinet held the coffee, which drawer held the takeout menus, which side of the bed Serena slept on, which way the shower handle turned for hot water. She knew these things because she had moved through the house with attention in the way that people move through spaces they are studying, rather than merely inhabiting. She drove home to Sandy Springs on that Sunday afternoon and sat in her own apartment for a long time without unpacking her bag. In 2013, the visits increased to 4. They were spread across the year. A long weekend in January, a visit in the spring, the 4th of July gathering, and a week in October when Simone told Serena that work had been particularly difficult and she needed the reset that only Serena's house could provide. Each visit, the catalog deepened. She learned the specific rhythm of Serena's morning routine, the order of it, the timing, the small rituals that constitute the texture of a person's daily life. She learned that David left for the office before 8 on Mondays and Wednesdays, and that on those mornings, Serena had a particular solo breakfast routine involving a specific podcast and a second cup of coffee on the back deck. She learned that Serena kept her important documents in the third drawer of the kitchen island, behind the takeout menus, in a red accordion folder with her name on the tab. She learned the name of every neighbor on the street and what Serena knew about each of them. She wrote it all down when she got home. In the composition notebook she had purchased in January of that year, in pence, small and precise. The October visit in 2013 was the one where Simone found the address book. Serena had stepped out to run an errand. A quick trip to the dry cleaner on Peachtree Road, 20 minutes at most. And David was in his basement office on a call. Simone was in the guest room, ostensibly resting. Instead, she moved through the master bedroom with the efficiency of someone who had already decided what she was looking for. The nightstand on Serena's side held three items: a charging cable, a lip balm, and the small cream-colored address book with the floral cover that Serena had been using for years as a combined password record and phone directory. The pin was written in pencil on the inside back cover, a habit from an era before password managers, maintained because Serena found the physical act of writing things down more reliable than any app. Simone photographed the page. She photographed the driver's license in Serena's wallet, which was in the top drawer of the dresser. She photographed the social security card behind it. She was back in the guest room with the door closed before she heard Serena's key in the front door. She was reading a magazine when Serena came to check on her and ask if she wanted anything from the kitchen. By 2014, the visits had reached 9, and the quality of Simone's attention had shifted in a way that David Webb registered without being able to name. He noticed that she asked questions about the business that went beyond casual interest. Specific questions about which assets were held jointly, whether the deed to the house included both names, how the succession structure of Webb and Associates worked in the event of an unexpected change in ownership. She framed these questions as admiration, as the natural curiosity of a proud sister. David answered them honestly each time, because he had no framework for answering otherwise. But later, in the quiet of evenings, he would find himself replaying the conversations with a discomfort he could neither locate precisely enough to address nor comfortably dismiss. He told his closest friend, Jerome, that Simone seemed to be paying attention in a way that went beyond sisterly interest, that she watched, that she studied, that sometimes in the middle of a dinner table conversation he would catch her eye, and she would be observing Serena with an expression that was not quite affection and not quite anything he had a word for. He said it felt like watching someone read a book they had read before, checking their memory against the text. Jerome said that sounded like a reach. David said maybe. He did not mention it to Jerome again for a long time. He raised it with Serena in November 2014. He was careful with his words. He chose them the way a man chooses words, when he knows the conversation can go badly if he says the wrong thing and, badly enough, wants to say the right thing to prepare for it first. He told her some of Simone's questions had a quality that he kept returning to, a thoroughness that seemed to exceed the context. He told her he did not want to be wrong or unkind, but that he could not, in good conscience, not mention it. Serena listened all the way through, and then she told him, with the complete and non-negotiable certainty of a woman who had decided, before the conversation began, that Simone was struggling and needed grace, and that the questions about the business were the questions of a woman working toward her own version of success. She said it without anger, which made it harder to push back against. David heard her. He backed down. He let it go the way a man lets things go when he knows that pressing further will cost him more than he is ready to pay. He would not raise it again. He would spend years coming back to that decision and measuring what it had cost. What happened on the same visit when David raised his concerns, on the same weekend, in the same house, was this. One afternoon, while David was on a conference call, and Serena was at a neighborhood association meeting that ran over its time, Simone spent 45 minutes in the master bedroom. She went through the dresser drawers with the systematic attention of someone who knows exactly what she is looking for. She photographed the interior of the jewelry box. She found the address book in Serena's nightstand and photographed the pin page. She went to the full-length mirror on the back of the closet door, and she stood in front of it for a considerable period of time. She stood in front of her sister's reflection, and she practiced. The walk, the bearing, the way Serena carried her shoulders, the forward quality of her movement that made people make way without realizing they were doing it. And then she went back downstairs and put a pot of water on for tea, and was sitting at the kitchen island reading a magazine with an entirely undisturbed expression when Serena came through the front door 40 minutes later, apologizing for being late. Fine, Simone said. Quiet. How was the meeting? The visit in the summer of 2015 was 11 days, the longest single stay Simone had taken, covered by the explanation that her apartment building was undergoing significant repairs. Serena had accepted this without question and had prepared the guest room with fresh linens and a new reading light she had ordered because she had noticed on a previous visit that the existing lamp was too dim for Simone's preference. She had cleared a section of the refrigerator and the bathroom cabinet with the generosity of a woman who loves her sister fully and trusts her completely. Those 11 days were the most productive period of the entire preparation. Simone had access to every room for 11 consecutive days. She was in the house during David's morning calls, Serena's afternoon appointments, the Sunday morning church preparation, the midweek grocery run. She absorbed the household's internal schedule with a comprehensiveness of someone who understands that 11 uninterrupted days of immersion produce a kind of knowledge that no number of weekend visits can replicate. By the end of 2015, Simone Carter had spent the equivalent of nearly 2 months in aggregate time inside the Webb household. She had the financial access, she had the documentation, she had the physical preparation in progress, she had the social architecture memorized, she had practiced the signature 40 times, she had been wearing the same perfume for 6 months, she had studied the bearing until it no longer required conscious effort to produce. She needed one person and one date and one 45-minute window on a quiet Sunday morning in August. Everything else was already in place. By early 2016, the preparation was complete in every dimension. Simone had conducted 3 small test transactions on the Carter Webb joint account, small enough not to be noticed, carefully spaced to avoid pattern detection, and had confirmed that her access read as routine. She had established a limited liability company in Marietta under a name with no visible connection to either herself or Serena, into which she planned to move the account funds in a specific sequence she had worked out in the back section of the notebook. She had notified her employer at Meridian Communications that she would be taking an extended leave of absence for a family emergency. She had arranged for her Sandy Springs apartment to continue on automatic payments while she transitioned everything she needed out of it and left behind what could accumulate unopened without raising immediate questions. She had purchased clothing from the stores Serena shopped at. She had been wearing Saint Star perfume for 8 months. She had lost 8 pounds, bringing her weight to within 2 pounds of Serena's, and had practiced Serena's bearing until she could produce it on demand. She needed one thing she could not do herself. In the early spring of 2016, she made contact with a man named Curtis Bowen through an intermediary, a contractor named Keith she had briefly dated years earlier, who moved in wider circles than his profession suggested, and who, when approached with a proposition, he understood immediately what kind of proposition it was, and made a referral without asking why. Curtis Bowen was 38 years old, with a record that included 2 arrests. Aggravated assault and robbery. He was not a sophisticated criminal. He was a man who had made bad choices when money was scarce and had continued making them after the scarcity was no longer the reason because the pattern had become easier to continue than to stop. They met in a parking lot off Flat Shoals Road one evening, and then at a Waffle House in Decatur at 2 in the morning. Public enough to prevent the wrong kind of incident, busy enough at that hour that a quiet conversation in a corner booth was unremarkable. Simone laid out the plan, the way someone lays out the details of a project they have been working on for a long time and are now ready to complete. The vehicle description: silver Lexus SUV, Georgia plates, a dent in the rear left panel that had not been repaired. The route: I-285 south to Cascade Road, then the surface streets through Cascade Heights toward a specific address. The window: approximately 45 minutes on a Sunday morning in August, when Atlanta was quiet and the route was consistent. She placed an envelope containing $4,000 in cash on the table between them. 4,000 more when it was done. Bowen picked up the envelope. He asked one question. Simone answered it. The meeting was over. He would testify 2 years later that in all of his years of bad decisions in difficult rooms, he had never sat across from anyone who spoke about ending a human life with the composure Simone Carter brought to that corner booth. He said she was calm, specific, deliberate, and he said she told him in her own words the reason for all of it, a sentence he carried with him from that Waffle House to the witness stand. She told him she was tired of being the version of herself that nobody chose. The back section of the composition notebook, 9 pages of operational planning, written in black ballpoint rather than pencil, was what investigators later described as one of the most methodical documents they had encountered in the state of Georgia. It had sequencing, it had contingencies, it had the specific attention to detail of a person who had been thinking about this for a very long time and had addressed every possibility before committing it to paper. And on the last line of the last page, written in the same careful black ballpoint as everything above it, 9 words and a period at the end. After this, I am Serena. On the evening of August 13th, 2016, the night before, Serena Carter Webb made a chicken and rice dish that she and David ate at the kitchen table, and then they watched a film on the couch and went to bed at 10:30. There was nothing in that evening that indicated anything other than what it was, a Saturday night in a home where two people who had chosen each other well were living the ordinary continuation of a good life. David fell asleep quickly. Serena read for 20 minutes before she turned off the light. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. It was the last ordinary night either of them would ever have, and it was ordinary in every direction. David was up first on August 14th, as he's almost always was. He made coffee in the French press, took the first cup to the back deck, and sat in the early morning August heat with nothing particular in his mind, the specific undramatic blank of a man on a Sunday morning, before the day has made any demands. Serena came downstairs at 7:15 in a pale linen sundress, with her hair wrapped and her wedding ring on. She never took it off, and she made her oat milk coffee and sat at the kitchen island. And they talked about a neighbor's new car and a book she was reading and a recipe she kept meaning to try. There was nothing in that conversation that needed to be said differently, nothing that needed to be said at all. Really, it was the conversation of two people comfortable enough with each other that the content of the words matters less than the fact of their being spoken together in the same kitchen on a Sunday morning. It was the conversation of a good marriage in ordinary time. It was the last one. At 8:45, Serena picked up her purse from the counter and her keys from the ceramic bowl in the entryway. She told David she was heading to her mother's. Gloria was making brunch and had asked her to come early for the biscuits. Serena made the best biscuits in the family and had made them since she was a teenager learning at Gloria's side, and the Sunday morning biscuit request had been a standing part of their relationship for years. David was on a work call by this point. He covered the phone with his hand and said, "Drive safe." Serena touched his shoulder as she passed. He raised one hand in the particular half-wave that had developed between them over years of these kinds of departures. The gesture that meant I see you and I love you, and I'll see you later, compressed into one raised hand, because they had been together long enough that the full sentence was understood from the abbreviation. She went out the front door. The door closed. He would think about that hand for the rest of his life. The route from Magnolia Crest Drive to Danner Drive on a Sunday morning in August takes approximately 35 minutes. Serena drove I-285 south to Cascade Road as she always did, then the surface streets through the geography she had grown up in. Past FL, Stanton Elementary, where she and Simone had learned to read in Mrs. Porter's class. Past Cascade United Methodist, where Reverend Moss had married her and David in October 2011, with 400 people watching. Past the park on the corner where she and Simone had spent summer afternoons as teenagers, trading turns on a bicycle with a bent front wheel. She drove past all of it without knowing it was the last time, because the last time never announces itself as the last time, and by the time you know which one it was, you are no longer there to say goodbye. Curtis Bowen was parked on a side street off Cascade Road at 9:15 in the morning. He had been there since 8:30. He had the description of the car, the route, the timing, and a 45-minute window in which nothing in the surrounding neighborhood was moving, with enough purpose to notice what was happening. What happened in that 45 minutes belongs to the medical examiner's record and to Bowen's eventual testimony and to the crime scene documentation assembled by DeKalb County investigators when Serena's body was found 4 months later. The record is precise. What the record cannot carry is what it cost. What it means that a woman drove a route that felt like home for the last time and never reached the house at the end of it. What it means that 34 years of correct decisions and genuine love and a life built from nothing ended on a side street she had driven past 100 times on her way to make biscuits at her mother's house. Serena Carter Webb was 34 years old. She never made it to Danner Drive. She never made the biscuits. She never came back to the house on Magnolia Crest Drive with the burgundy front door. She never saw David again after the shoulder touch and the half wave. She deserved better than what blood gave her. Gloria Carter called David at 1:14 in the afternoon to ask if Serena was on her way. She had been expecting her for 2 hours. David called Serena's phone, and it rang twice and went to voicemail. This detail told him everything he needed to know without yet telling him what he needed to know, because Serena Carter Webb did not send calls to voicemail. The voicemail was not Serena choosing not to answer. The voicemail was a phone going to voicemail, because no one was there to answer it. He called again at 3 and at 4, and by 6 o'clock, he was at the Atlanta Police Department filing a missing persons report, describing his wife, describing the route, describing the car, giving the details of a life that had been present at 8:45 that morning and was absent now in a way that had no explanation he was willing to accept. The investigation that followed moved in the way that investigations involving missing Black women in America so often move in the initial phase, with a casualness that the investigators would later be unable to adequately defend in the courtroom where their decisions would be examined under oath. The questions asked of David Webb in the first 48 hours were questions built for a specific narrative. Had there been conflict in the marriage? Had there been financial difficulty? Had Serena ever expressed a desire to leave? David answered every question with the steady precision of a man who understands that the only way through the questions is to answer them completely and without defensiveness and keep the investigation focused on finding his wife, rather than confirming the story someone had already decided to tell. He performed the specific kind of controlled, cooperative grief that the system required of him if it was going to take him seriously. And he performed it because the alternative was to let Serena become a statistic, and he would not allow that. Gloria Carter spent the first night on the floor of her bedroom on Danner Drive, not at the side of the bed, on the actual floor, flat, because she felt that whatever was happening to her daughter required her to be as close to the ground as she could physically get. She prayed with a ferocity and a specificity she had never brought to prayer before. Not the gratitude-shaped Sunday morning prayers, but something entirely about Serena, and entirely about the particular terror of a mother who does not know where her child is. She called Simone at 10 o'clock that night. Simone answered on the second ring. She said, "Oh my God." She asked the right questions. She said she would be there first thing in the morning, and they would figure this out together. She said it in Serena's voice, with Serena's cadence, with the specific quality of reassurance that the Carter women had always given each other in the hard moments, because she had been studying that quality for 4 years, and she could produce it on demand. Simone arrived at Gloria's house at 9 the following morning with food from Busy Bee Cafe on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, fried catfish, cornbread, collard greens in a container with a handwritten label. She had gotten the label right. She had gotten the food right. She had gotten the timing right. The food from Busy Bee was a specific language in the Carter family. It was what Serena brought when someone needed to be held up, when the grief was large enough to require a physical anchor. Simone had watched Serena bring that food to that table enough times to understand the full grammar of the gesture, and she executed it without a single error. She held Gloria's hand. She cried in the right places. She said the right things. She was so completely, so precisely, so thoroughly right about everything. Every expression timed correctly, every word chosen correctly, every gesture landing exactly where it was supposed to land. That Gloria Carter, sitting at her own kitchen table with her real daughter already dead in the Georgia woods, and the woman who killed her, holding her hand and smelling, like her perfume, felt comforted. That is what 4 years of preparation produces. That is what the composition notebook was for. Over the 10 weeks that followed Serena's disappearance, the wrong woman lived inside the right life, with a fluency that still disturbs the people who encountered her during that period. The first Sunday after Serena's disappearance, Simone sat in Serena's pew at Greater Restoration Baptist Church and sang the opening hymn and shook hands during the greeting portion and accepted the pastor's prayers and the church mother's embraces with Serena's face and Serena's warmth and Serena's specific way of receiving the love of a community that had known her for 7 years. Reverend Williams announced from the pulpit that the Webb family was going through an unimaginable trial and called the congregation to surround them with every form of support available. And the congregation responded with the fullness that communities respond with when one of their own is in crisis: food, prayer, presence, the specific vocabulary of care that does not require the crisis to be resolved before it is offered. Simone received all of it. She wept at the appropriate moments. She said the things that Serena would have said. She was completely convincing. She had been watching Serena operate in this community for 4 years, and she understood, with the thoroughness of someone who had studied the performance rather than lived it, exactly what was expected and how to provide it. The dinner party came 3 weeks into the impersonation when David's colleague, Marcus, and his wife Janelle came over for a meal that Marcus had organized because he believed David needed the normalcy of friends sitting around a table together. Simone had known this dinner was a significant test. She had met Marcus and Janelle on multiple occasions during her years of visits, but the intimacy of a dinner table over the course of several hours was a different kind of exposure than a casual greeting at the door. She prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, with research and practice, and the specific attention to detail that had characterized every step of the process. She cooked a meal she had watched Serena make on 2 previous occasions. The meal was almost right, more garlic than Serena used, and the seasoning layered in a slightly different sequence. Marcus said nothing. Janelle said nothing. The dinner proceeded through its normal arc of conversation and warmth, and at the end of the evening, Janelle hugged the woman she believed was Serena and said she was glad she was holding up. Simone said thank you with Serena's gratitude and Teresa's smile and closed the door and stood in the entry hall for a moment before she went back to the kitchen to clear the dishes. David's mother, Charlotte Webb, visited from College Park in the 3rd week of October. Driven by David's younger brother Kevin, Charlotte Webb was 64 years old, a woman of the particular composed dignity of a generation that had learned to carry difficulty without advertising it, and she had loved Serena Carter Webb from the moment her son brought her to Sunday dinner in 2009. She embraced the woman at the door with the fullness of that love and held on for a moment longer than a brief greeting would account for, and when she pulled back, she said, "You look tired, baby. You're not eating enough." Simsu said she was trying. Charlotte said, "You have to take care of yourself so you can be strong for David." They sat in the living room together for 2 hours, and Charlotte talked about specific memories of Serena, the qualities she had admired, the way Serena had always made her feel welcome. Simone received each memory with the appropriate expression and the appropriate response, and she navigated the 2 hours without a single identifiable error. When Charlotte left that evening, she told Kevin on the drive back to college Park that she was relieved. She said she had been worried about how Serena was holding up, but that she seemed more herself than expected. Kevin said that was good to hear. The moment that came closest to his exposure, not the hand incident, not the name incident, but the closest the impersonation came to collapsing from the outside in, happened on a Thursday morning in late September when Gloria Carter arrived at the Buckhead house unannounced. Gloria had been sitting in her kitchen on Danner Drive and had decided, with the sudden directional certainty that sometimes arrives without a preceding thought, that she needed to see her daughter right now and was not going to call ahead, because calling ahead would give someone time to prepare. She rang the doorbell at 9:45. Simone was in the master bedroom going through Serena's remaining documentation, files that still needed to be accessed and transferred. She heard the bell and checked the security camera feed on Serena's phone and saw Gloria's car in the driveway. She had 4 minutes to transition from what she had been doing to what she needed to be. She closed the files. She smoothed her clothing. She descended the stairs at an unhurried pace. She opened the front door with Serena's face arranged into the expression of a woman who is glad to see her mother on a difficult morning. She said, "Mama, I didn't know you were coming. Come in." Gloria stepped into the house and looked at her and said, "I just needed to see you." Simone said, "I know. I'm glad you came." Gloria stayed 3 hours. She left without the certainty she had come for, but she left with something she could not yet name that she would return to in the weeks ahead, and eventually understand completely. 17 days after Serena's disappearance, Simone walked into the Buckhead branch of First National Bank with Serena's identification and Serena's knowledge and Serena's unhurried manner and made a series of transactions totaling just under $40,000 that moved money from the Carter Webb joint account into the LLC she had, established 3 months earlier in Marietta. The teller had no reason to question anything. Simone knew the account number and the PIN and the security questions and every piece of authentication required by the fraud prevention system. She thanked the teller by name when the transaction was complete. She drove away in the silver Lexus with the dent in the rear left panel because she had kept Serena's car, because the car was part of the presentation, and she had not yet reached the point in the transition where it needed to be replaced. Patricia Odom, who lived 3 houses down from the Webb home on Magnolia Crest Drive, passed Simone in the driveway on a morning in early September. Simone's was in a pair of Serena's jeans and a white linen shirt from Serena's closet, with Serena's keys in her hand and Serena's amber and jasmine perfume light in the morning air around her. Patricia said good morning with the warmth of a neighbor who has been hoping for good news. Simone said good morning back in Serena's cadence, with Serena's particular quality of presence. The way Serena made even a brief interaction feel like the other person had her full attention. Patricia watched her pull out of the driveway and thought, she seems to be doing all right. She brought a sweet potato pie the following Saturday. She sat in Serena's kitchen for an hour. Simone asked about Patria's grandchildren by name Amara and Josiah, 7 and 5, because Serena had mentioned them in passing 18 months earlier, and Simone had written it down. She asked about Patricia's husband's knee surgery, the one he had in the spring. Patricia left and told her husband over dinner that she was relieved Serena had come home. He asked what she meant. She said she wasn't entirely sure of the details, but that things seemed to be working out. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. David Webb was emerging from the grief fog in fragments, moments of clarity surfacing briefly between the longer stretches of a loss so complete that ordinary functioning required effort. But somewhere around mid-October, 2 months after Serena's disappearance, the fog was thinning at the edges, and in those thin places, David Webb began to notice things. The hand was the first one. A Wednesday evening at the kitchen table after dinner, the woman who had been living in his house for weeks reached across the table for her glass, and she reached with her right hand, and something in David's peripheral vision registered it a half second before his conscious mind processed what it had registered. He looked up. She had already withdrawn the hand. He went back to what he had been thinking about, but it stayed with him, in the back room of his mind where things go when the mind is not ready to directly examine them, but cannot let them go entirely. It stayed because Serena was left-handed. He had watched her reach with her left hand across every table they had ever sat at together. The first dinner in Virginia Highland in 2009, every kitchen meal on Magnolia Crest, the coffee cup on the morning of August 14th when she picked it up before she left. Always without exception, the left hand. The right hand reaching was wrong. The right hand was wrong in a way he could not yet name, but that lodged itself in the accumulating file his mind was keeping without his full conscious participation. 3 weeks later, David came into the kitchen early, before she had heard him, and said her name, not Serena. Her actual name, the one he had been saying for 5 years with the specific inflection that belongs to two people who have been saying each other's names for long enough that the name itself has become a private frequency. She turned around a half second too late, and in the turning, in the space between his voice landing and her face responding, there was a recalibration, a fractional adjustment of expression so fast that most people, in most states of mind, would not have caught it. But David Webb, in that thin fog morning clarity, caught it. He saw the face go from wherever it had actually been to where it was supposed to be. He saw the smile arrive. He heard Serena's good morning delivered in Serena's voice. He said good morning back. He went to the French press and stood there for a moment with his hand on the handle. He did not press it down right away. He stood there and thought about the hand. He thought about the name. He thought about the chicken and rice with too much garlic. He stood at the French press and he knew. He did not yet fully know what he knew, but he knew. He called Raymond Cole the following Monday morning from the parking garage on Peachtree Road with the engine off and the phone in his hand. Gloria Carter had been keeping her own file. She had started keeping it not with a decision to investigate, but with a feeling she could not ignore. The feeling that had been building since the first visit after Serena's disappearance, since the first time the woman with Serena's face had sat at her kitchen table, and something in the texture of the interaction had been almost right, but not entirely. Gloria had raised two daughters for 34 years. She knew both of them in the specific way that mothers who pay attention know their children, not just their faces and their voices, but the interior rhythms of them, the particular ways they were themselves that persisted across every context. She knew Serena's left-handedness. She knew Simone's way of answering a half-second earlier than the pause would have been, because Simone always reached for the answer before it was fully ready. She knew the difference. She had always known the difference. And the difference she was observing now was telling her something she did not yet have the evidence to say out loud. She bought a small notepad at the dollar store on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive and kept it in her purse. After each visit or phone call, she wrote down what she had asked and what came back. She was not testing for large things. Large things could be passed. Anyone who had spent 4 years paying attention could pass a test on the large things. She was testing for the small things, the private things, the things that lived in the specific geographic space between a mother and the daughter she had raised, the things that had never been observed from outside because they had happened in kitchens and in cars, and in the quiet hours after, church that are the exclusive territory of two people who have been genuinely close for a very long time. The first wrong answer came in a conversation about Raymond. Gloria mentioned a specific Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving of 2003, when Raymond's health had been at a relatively stable point, and the family had driven to Macon to visit his sister, and Raymond had insisted on driving the whole way, even though his knees were in the early stages of their long decline, and had sung along to the radio the entire 4-hour drive in a way that made everyone in the car laugh, because Raymond Carter was many things, but a singer was not among them. Gloria told the first part of the story and waited. The woman across the table said she remembered that trip and that Daddy had been in such a good mood the whole visit. She said it correctly. Daddy, not father, not dad. But she said he had been in a good mood the whole visit, and Gloria did not correct her because the correction itself was information she needed to keep private. Raymond Carter had not been in a good mood the whole visit. He had had a difficult pain episode on the second evening that had worried Gloria enough that she had almost suggested they drive back early. Only the people in that house in Macon that weekend knew about it. So had been there. She would have known. The woman across the table had gotten the broad strokes right and missed the specific detail that only the real person could have supplied. The second wrong answer came 2 visits later, about a dress. Serena had worn a specific dress to a formal event in the spring of 2014, a deep green, wrap dress she had borrowed from a colleague who had later asked for it back, an exchange that had produced an awkward conversation that Serena had told Gloria about, and that they had laughed about together. Gloria mentioned the dress and said she still had the photo Serena had sent of herself in it. The woman across the table said yes. She had loved that dress, had worn it twice that year. The dress had been borrowed. Serena had worn it once, returned it, and laughed about it with her mother. The woman across Gloria's kitchen table had just described a dress that did not belong to her, as though it did. The third wrong answer was about church, and it was the one that brought the temperature in Gloria's chest to something she had to actively manage to keep off her face. Gloria mentioned a Sunday morning in the winter of 2009, when she and Serena had gone to a sunrise service at Cascade United, Methodist, that started at 5:30 in the morning, and afterward had walked to get breakfast because the fellowship hall coffee was weak. She told the first part of the story and waited. The woman said yes, she remembered, and said the service had been beautiful, and she always loved those early morning services. Gloria said, "The coffee was terrible, though." The woman laughed and said it really was. And Gloria nodded and looked at her hands, because she and Serena had not gone anywhere for breakfast after that sunrise service. The diner on Cascade Road had been closed for renovations that winter, and they had gone home and made eggs in the kitchen on Danner Drive instead, and Serena had made a joke about the Fellowship Hall coffee that Gloria had remembered for years, because it was funny in the specific way that Serena was funny. They had gone home. The woman across the table had never been there. She had inferred the most reasonable continuation of the story and inferred it wrong. The fourth wrong answer came about Simone's herself, and this was the one that cost Gloria the most to maintain composure through, because it required asking a question about the woman sitting across from her and receiving an answer that was wrong about her own sister's birthday. Gloria mentioned the dinner Serena had organized for Simone's 30th birthday in November 2011, 1 month after Serena's wedding, a small dinner at a specific restaurant in Midtown that Simone had mentioned wanting to try with four of Simone's closest friends, and a toast that Simone had described afterward as the most seen she had felt in years. Gloria mentioned the dinner and the toast and said she had heard it was something special. The woman across the table said yes, it had been a wonderful evening, and said the restaurant had been that Italian place on Peachtree that she had always liked. The restaurant had been a West African fusion restaurant in Midtown that had closed the following year. Simone had mentioned it specifically in the week before her birthday, and Serena had gotten a reservation specifically because of that mention. It was not Italian. It had never been Italian. The woman sitting across Gloria's kitchen table had just described her own birthday dinner incorrectly because she had not been at her own birthday dinner. She had been at a table being celebrated by the woman she had spent 4 years planning to become, and she did not know the name of the restaurant where it happened. Gloria wrote it all down. 9 wrong answers across 6 visits, documented in the small notepad in her purse that had cost $1.25 at the dollar store on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, and that would eventually be referenced in the trial of Simone Renee Carter as evidence of a mother who had known, with certainty, weeks before the official investigation reached the same conclusion. She did not confront the woman. She did not telegraph that she was testing. She sat across the kitchen table on 6 different occasions and asked the questions and wrote down the answers and waited until she had enough to take somewhere that could do something with it. And every time she walked out of her own house after one of those visits, she sat in her car in the driveway for a moment before she drove away, long enough to acknowledge, in the specific private language of a woman, doing the hardest thing she had ever done, that she knew, and that she was going to do what needed to be done, and that she was going to make sure that the record knew who Serena Carter Webb had been, and what had been taken from her, and who had taken it. She called her sister Diane that evening after the 4th wrong answer and said, "That is not my child sitting in my kitchen. The woman who has been coming to my house since August is not Serena. I don't know everything yet, but I know that." Diane said, "Gloria, are you hearing yourself?" Gloria said, I hear myself clearly. I have known my daughters for 34 years. I know my own child." David Webb called Raymond Cole during the same week Gloria made her call to Diane. He did not know Gloria had been building her own file. Gloria did not know he had been building his. They would not compare notes until Raymond Cole was already 3 days into his investigation and had pulled the first set of records. When they finally sat together in Cole's office on a Tuesday afternoon, each of them laying out what they had been collecting, there was a long silence before anyone spoke. Not the silence of people who were surprised. The silence of people who already knew, who have known for some time, and who are now in the presence of confirmation that the knowing has been real all along. Raymond Cole had worked private investigations in Atlanta for 19 years and had built a practice on the specific category of case where a family knows something is wrong and the official investigation has not caught up. He was 51 years old, meticulous, and possessed of the particular patience of a man who had learned that the most important evidence is usually the evidence that no one thought to look for. because they had already decided what the answer was. He had left the Fulton County Detectives Division after a principled disagreement about the early closure of a cold case he believed had been closed not because it was resolved, but because it was inconvenient, and he had spent the 19 years since building a practice that operated on the assumption that inconvenient cases were the only ones worth taking seriously. When David Webb sat across his desk and laid out what he had been observing, Cole listened for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he said he would need a retainer, and 2 weeks he had something usable in 3. His first step was fundamental, an independent attempt to establish the current location of Simone Carter. He pulled her credit activity. He ran a lease status check on her Sandy Springs apartment. Current on payment, mail uncollected, utility usage minimal. He called Meridian Communications, posing as a reference contact. He was told that Simone Carter had been on extended leave of absence for a family emergency since mid-August. Mid-August, the same week as Serena's disappearance. Cole wrote this down and put a line under it. He requested cell tower records through contacts he had maintained from his Fulton County years. Simone's personal phone had last pinged a tower in the Sandy Springs area on August 12th, 2 days before Serena's disappearance. After August 12th, the phone was silent. No calls, no texts, no data activity, no tower pings. The phone had been turned off, physically removed from service, or destroyed. A woman does not turn off her personal phone permanently 2 days before her sister disappears unless she knows with certainty what is about to happen to her sister and has prepared for the removal of that phone as part of a planned sequence. Cole moved to the next column in his notebook. He traced the prepaid phone through careful reconstruction of the calling patterns associated with Simone's personal records in the months preceding August. A second number appeared, a prepaid device with an activation date in March 2016 and a deactivation date in mid-August 2016, which had communicated across its active period with one number that stood out. 14 calls in the final 6 weeks to a number registered to one Curtis Bowen, DeKalb County. Cole had Bowen's name and record in his hands within a week. He then obtained, through a financial fraud contact, a security camera still frame from a Buckhead branch of First National Bank, showing a woman presenting Serena's identification 17 days after her disappearance. He placed the still frame on his desk, and David Webb looked at it for a long time. Then David said, "That is not my wife," Cole said. "I know." The physical search of Simone's Sandy Springs apartment, conducted on an expedited warrant, based on the assembled financial fraud evidence, produced the composition notebook from the back of the bedroom closet. Investigators went through it page by page. The technician who read the back section, the 9 pages of operational planning, reached the last line and sat quietly before calling his supervisor in without explaining why. His supervisor read the same 9 pages and made the call to the lead detective on the Serena Carter Webb missing persons case. Cole delivered his complete file to Atlanta PD on a Thursday afternoon in November. Detective Thomas Reeves read the file in 45 minutes and made 3 calls. By end of day, the case had been reclassified as a homicide investigation. A DeKalb County search team had been mobilized based on cell tower data, placing Bowen's vehicle in the woodland area east of Lithonia on August 14th. A warrant for the arrest of Simone Renee Carter had been prepared and was waiting only for what the search team was about to find. The search began at 7 in the morning on November 21st, 2016. At 11:14, a technician working through the third quadrant of the search area found Serena Carter Webb beneath a disturbed section of ground under a stand of pine trees covered with branches and debris in the manner of someone who had expected the covering to be sufficient until other arrangements could be made. She was identified by her dental records. She was identified also by her wedding ring, which was on her left hand, the hand she had always, without exception, reached with. Detective Reeves called David Webb at 12:40 in the afternoon. He told him they had found Serena. David was quiet for a period of time that Reeves counted afterward. Not the silence of Foshuk, but the silence of a man receiving the confirmation of something he has known for weeks and has been carrying alone. Then David asked one question. He said, "Was she suffering at the end?" Reeves told him what the evidence indicated. David said thank you. The call ended. Simone Carter was arrested at 847 Magnolia Crest Drive at 8:45 on the morning of November 22, 2016. Two vehicles, Detective Reeves, two uniformed officers, and David Webb on the porch of the house that had been his wife's, present because Reeves had correctly believed that David's presence might produce something useful. One knock. The door opened. She was wearing Serena's pale blue kimono robe, the one Serena had bought on a trip to Charleston. Serena's coffee mug in her hand, the tall gray ceramic one with the hairline crack near the base that Serena had been meaning to replace. She looked at the officers. She looked at Reeves. She looked at David Webb. And she did not scream. She did not run. She did not collapse. She set the mug down on the hallway table. Carefully, with both hands, in the specific way you set something down when you do not want it to break, and she stepped back from the door and said nothing at all. The mug sat on the hallway table, Serena's mug, set down by the hands that had put Serena in the ground 3 months ago. David Webb looked at it. He looked at Simone Carter, and then the officers moved forward and Simone turned and offered her hands behind her back and did not resist. Curtis Bowen was arrested 2 days later at a motel in Forest Park. He called a lawyer within the hour. His lawyer read the evidence and explained what it meant for his options. Bowen called the district attorney's office the following morning. He cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. He accepted and began preparing to testify. The trial of Simone Renee Carter opened on January 8, 2018, in the Superior Court of Fulton County before the Honorable Judge Margaret Whitfield. It lasted 6 weeks. It drew reporters from every Atlanta television station, from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and from national outlets that had in the preceding years begun to apply more of their resources to the cases of Black women who disappeared, and were not immediately treated as the emergencies they were. The courtroom was full every day. Lori Carter attended every session. David Webb attended every session. The Cascade Heights community attended in shifts, the way communities attend to things that belong to everyone, even when they happen to one person. The Spelman Alumni Network attended. The Greater Restoration Baptist Congregation attended. The neighbors from Magnolia Crest Drive attended. They came because what was being adjudicated was not just the murder of Serena Carter Webb, but the full accounting of a life that had started on Danner Drive and deserved to be acknowledged with the completeness that it had been lived. Ada Keisha Daniels' opening statement lasted 90 minutes, and those who were in the courtroom that morning have described it with a consistency that indicates they all heard the same thing in the same way. She told the jury they were about to hear the story of a plan, not a crime of passion, not a terrible moment of lost control, a plan that had been assembling itself for 4 years before it was executed, a plan with a notebook, a plan with a prepaid phone, a plan with a 43-page preparation document, and a 9-page operational section, and a last line that she wanted the jury to hold in their minds from her opening statement through the verdict. She wrote it on the whiteboard at the front of the courtroom, in large, plain letters. After this, I am Serena. She told the jury that those 5 words were the entire story. Everything they were going to hear over the next 6 weeks was the evidence for and against those 5 words. She told them to listen carefully and let the evidence speak. Then she sat down. Harold Baines's opening statement for the defense was competent and presented the strongest version of the argument the evidence allowed. He told the jury that what they were seeing was a grief-stricken woman who had made terrible financial decisions in the aftermath of a disappearance that had destabilized her entire world, and that the prosecution was asking them to interpret those decisions as evidence of premeditation on the basis of a notebook that could be read multiple ways, and the testimony of a man, Curtis Bowen, whose cooperation with the prosecution was entirely self-interested. He told them that reasonable doubt was not a technicality but a principle, and that the principle existed specifically for situations like this one. He was measured and credible. The argument was not sufficient. He knew it was not sufficient before the trial began, but it was the argument the evidence allowed, and he made it as well as it could be made. The forensic financial expert testified on the 4th day. She walked the jury through the test transactions. The 3 small accesses of the Carter Webb joint account made in the year preceding August 2016, executed from locations that cell tower data placed in Simone's proximity rather than Serena's during time windows when Serena's own phone was documented to have been active at a different location. She explained what the test transactions demonstrated about intent, not theft, since the amounts were negligible, but reconnaissance. She used that word, reconnaissance, and let it sit. She explained the LLC established in Marietta 3 months before Serena's disappearance and the sequence of transfers that had moved just under $40,000 through it in the weeks following August 14th. Harold Baines cross-examined her for 2 hours, focusing on the possibility of innocent explanations for each element in isolation. She acknowledged the theoretical possibility of innocent explanations for individual elements, while maintaining that the combination, taken together, did not support an innocent reading. The cell tower expert testified on the fifth day and the morning of the sixth. He presented the complete call record of the prepaid device, its activation date, its usage pattern, the 14 calls to Curtis Bowen's number in the 6-week window before August 14th, and its deactivation 3 days before Serena's disappearance. He presented the geographical mapping of the prepaid device's activity, the locations where it had been used, none of which were consistent with Simone's Sandy Springs residence or Midtown office, but several of which were consistent with the parking lot off Flat Shoals Road and the Decatur Waffle House. Harold Baines's cross-examination of the cell tower expert lasted most of an afternoon and focused on the limitations of tower data as a precise location tool. The expert acknowledged the limitations and maintained that the patterns were consistent with the prosecution's account and inconsistent with any alternative account the defense had offered. Bowen's cross-examination was the longest of the trial. Harold Baines spent a full day and a half attacking Bowen's credibility, his criminal record, his motivations for cooperation, and the specific details of his account. He asked Bowen whether the sentence he claimed Simone had said about being tired of being the version of herself that nobody chose was something he had fabricated to provide a motive the prosecution needed. Bowen looked at Baines for a moment before he answered. He said, "She said it. I heard it. I didn't need to make up anything. The prosecution had everything they needed without that sentence. I'm telling it because it's what happened." The courtroom was quiet after that exchange in a way that had weight to it. The prosecution also presented testimony from Detective Thomas Reeves, who described the original investigation and its deficiencies with a professional candor that was unusual and notable. He acknowledged that the case had not received, in its first 90 days, the attention it should have received. He acknowledged the questions asked of David Webb in those early days, and the narrative those questions reflected. He said that when Raymond Cole brought him the file in November, he had spent 45 minutes reading it and had been unable to account for the fact that much of the foundation had been available from the beginning if the right questions had been asked. Harold Baines did not cross-examine Reeves extensively. There was nothing to gain from it. The defense called 2 witnesses. The first was a psychologist who testified about the effects of grief and trauma on decision-making, an attempt to contextualize Simone's financial actions as the product of a destabilized mental state. ADA Daniels' cross-examination focused on the timeline of the LLC, established 3 months before August 14th, and asked the psychologist to explain how grief from a disappearance that had not yet occurred could have produced the impaired decision-making that resulted in the establishment of that company. The psychologist acknowledged that the timeline presented a difficulty for the theory. The second defense witness was Denise Ware, Simone's former supervisor at Meridian Communications. Denise Ware gave honest testimony about a woman she had respected and supervised. She answered every question directly and did not offer more than she was asked. When Adia Daniels asked whether the Simone Carter she had supervised was capable of what the prosecution alleged, Ware was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I would have told you no 3 years ago." She said, "I don't know how to answer that question anymore." And she looked at her hands. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran its first story about Serena's disappearance on August 19, 2016, 5 days after she vanished, which was 5 days later than community advocates noted it should have run. The story was 9 paragraphs on the local news section of the website, with a photograph of Serena at a corporate event, professional, smiling. wearing the deep green wrap dress that had been incorrectly described in Gloria Carter's kitchen 2 months later. It generated moderate engagement and was shared within Atlanta's Black professional community with a specific urgency reflecting an awareness of what happened to Miss Black women when their stories did not reach wide audiences quickly enough. Spelman alumni networks shared it. Greater Restoration Baptist shared it. The Cascade Heights Neighborhood Association shared it. The people who loved Serena Carter Webb understood that attention was a resource and that the resource needed to be applied immediately and consistently. The national coverage did not arrive until after the arrest. When the story broke in November, when it became not the story of a missing Black woman, but the story of a twin sister impersonation and a planned murder, and a composition notebook with 43 pages of preparation, and a woman who had been living inside her dead sister's life for 3 months, the national media found it in the way that national media finds stories that compress several large narratives into a single case. It was a true crime story. It was a story about the treatment of missing Black women by law enforcement. It was a story about identity, about envy, about the specific violence of being replaced rather than simply lost. Every major network ran a segment. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a long-form piece that was shared hundreds of thousands of times. The story arrived in the national consciousness and stayed there in the way that stories stay when they touch something already present and waiting to be named. The Spelman College community's response was particular and worth understanding on its own terms. Serena had graduated from Spelman in 2003 and had maintained her connection to the institution in the active, invested way that Spelman women tend to maintain their connections, donating annually, serving on an alumni advisory committee for the business administration program in the 2 years before her disappearance. When her story became national news, the Spelman community's grief was organized and vocal, and specifically focused on the dimensions of the case that related to the inadequate initial investigation. The Alumni Network issued a public statement. Several prominent Spelman graduates used their platforms to name what had happened. Not just the crime itself, but the 5 days before the first news story, and the questions asked of David Webb in the initial investigation, and the particular casualness of an official response that had treated a missing Buckhead woman with less urgency than the address should have warranted. The statement was shared widely. It was part of the conversation that accompanied the trial. The Cascade Heights community attended the trial in the way that communities attend to things that belong to everyone. They came in groups, rotating across the 6 weeks, making sure the courtroom was never less than half filled with the people who had known Gloria Carter for decades, and who understood that what was being adjudicated was not just the murder of Serena Carter Webb, but the full accounting of a life that had started on Danner Drive and deserved to be acknowledged with the completeness it had been lived. They brought food to Gloria's house on the evenings after testimony days. They sat with her. They drove her to the courthouse on the days she testified and waited outside and drove her home afterward. They did not ask her to perform her grief for their benefit. They simply stayed present in the specific way that communities stay present when one of their own needs to be surrounded rather than alone. Patricia Odom spoke in the long-form piece in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She said, "I sat with her for an hour. I asked about her grandchildren. She knew their names. She asked about my husband's knee. I left that house feeling better than I had in weeks because I thought Serena was home." The reporter asked her how she felt knowing what she now knew about that hour. She said, "I don't have a word for it. I've been looking for the word and I haven't found it. I know she was gone by then. I know I was sitting with the woman who killed her, but I was sitting with her thinking I was comforting Serena. I don't know what to do with that. I don't think there's a place to put it." Gloria Carter testified in the 4th week of trial. She wore black. She had prepared herself for the stand the way she prepared herself for the hardest things in her life, with prayer, with sleep, with the specific gathering of self that comes from 61 years of learning how to carry what needs carrying without letting it carry you. She told the jury about 2 daughters born 11 minutes apart on a November evening at Grady Memorial Hospital in 1981. She told them about the house on Danner Drive and Raymond's Coffee Can Savings. and the particular pride of a family that had not been given anything and had built what it had through discipline and intention. She told them about Spellman and about David Webb and about the burgundy front door in Buckhead that the neighbors talked about for the warmth of it. She told them about the Savannah trip, about the restaurant on River Street and the price of the menu, and the Smalzer place 2 blocks Lossamus 2 blocks away, and the plastic chairs and the paper napkins and the best fried shrimp of her life, and getting lost when she was almost exactly where she needed to be. She told them about sitting at her kitchen table in November and framing the test and waiting for the answer and hearing the wrong thing come back from a woman who had guessed what the answer should be and missed it entirely because she had never been there. She told them about the notepad in her purse. She told them about 9 wrong answers across 6 visits. She told them about calling her sister Diane and saying, "That is not my child." She was on the stand for 4 hours. She did not cry once. The people in that courtroom would all describe her the same way afterward. They would say she was the most composed person in the room. They would say she was devastating. They would say she seemed to be doing, in those 4 hours, exactly what she had come to do, making sure that whatever came after this trial, the record would know who Serena Carter Webb had been before the record became only about how she died. David Webb testified for a day and a half. He described his marriage and his wife and the morning of August 14th with a precision that was clearly costing him something to maintain. He described the press and the linen sundress and the oat milk coffee and the kitchen conversation and the shoulder touch and the half wave and the covered phone and the voicemail at 1:14 in the afternoon. He described the 10 weeks during which Simone Carter had lived in his house and occupied his wife's life while he was too consumed by grief to examine his immediate environment with the attention it deserved. He described the hand reaching right. He described the name and the half-second delay and the recalibration he caught in that morning kitchen light. He described calling Raymond Cole from a parked car with the engine off. During his testimony, Simone Carter looked at him for approximately 2/3 of the time and then looked away. She did not change her expression. She did not show anything that could be reliably characterized as remorse or grief or recognition. The jury would describe this in post-trial interviews as the most unsettling thing about the entire proceeding. Not the notebook, not the photograph, not the financial records, but the steadiness. The complete, sustained, unbroken steadiness of a woman watching everything she had done be laid out in a courtroom and registering none of it on her face. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. On a Thursday morning in March 2018, they returned a verdict, guilty on all 3 counts. First-degree murder, identity theft, financial fraud. Judge Whitfield sentenced Simone Carter to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She addressed Simone directly before the sentence was pronounced, in language that was clear and complete, and without any element of performance, and she said what needed to be said about a woman who had planned the end of her sister's life with the methodical patience of someone who had decided years before the plan was executed that the life her sister had built was something she was going to take. Simone Carter received the sentence without visible reaction. She looked at David Webb as it was read. He looked back. Then he looked at his hands. Curtis Bowen received 25 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2034. David Webb sold the house on Magnolia Crest Drive in the fall of 2018. He sold it to a young couple from College Park, a teacher and an accountant who had been saving for years, and who drove through those gates and walked through that front door with the burgundy paint and said yes before they had seen the second floor. He relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina. He opened a second office for Webb & Associates in 2019. He remarried in 2022, by all accounts of people who know him, genuinely well. But people who have known loss the way David Webb knew it understand that doing well is not the same as being whole. That a man can be fine, can be in fact more than fine, and still carry something formed by a Sunday morning in August, when he raised one hand and did not look up. Gloria Carter still lives on Danner Drive in Cascade Heights. She still attends Cascade United Methodist Church, the same building where Reverend Moss married her daughter to a good man in October 2011. She still makes biscuits on Sunday mornings, fewer than before, because the appetite for a full batch belongs to a morning when there is someone to share it with, and the specific someone is no longer there. She has spoken about Serena in two published interviews, and in both of them, she has said the same thing. She said that she raised two daughters to know their worth, that one of them believed it and one of them did not, that the one who did not took the one who did, and that learning to live inside that sentence, learning to carry the specific weight of a mother who raised both the victim and the person who took her is the work of the rest of her life. She says she is doing that work. She says it gets somewhat easier, not completely, somewhat. And she says what keeps her moving through the days is the knowledge that Serena's life was not reducible to how it ended. That 34 years of a good life, built correctly and loved fully and given generously, cannot be erased by the $8,000 that ended it. That the record knows who Serena Carter Webb was, and that she, Gloria Carter, made sure of it. Serena Carter Webb spent 34 years building a life that her own blood decided was worth more than she was. She built it from a two-bedroom brick ranch in Cascade Heights to a four-bedroom home in Buckhead, from double shifts and coffee can savings, and the particular inheritance of parents who worked without complaint and gave everything they had. She graduated from Spelman and built a career and married a man who listened and remembered and made a home with a burgundy front door that the neighbors remembered and loved the people in her life with the kind of love that expresses itself as attention, as remembering what people need before they ask, as arriving with the right food at the right time, as keeping your wedding ring on your left hand every day for 5 years and never once taking it off. She was going to make biscuits. She was going to spend a Sunday with her mother. She was 34 years old, and she had been building her life correctly. And she had touched her husband's shoulder, and he had raised one hand, and she had gone out the front door. She deserved better than what blood gave her. There are people who will tell you that envy is manageable, that it rises and passes and has no lasting power unless you give it power, and that is true for most people in most circumstances. But Serena Carter's story is what happens at the far end of the spectrum, where the envy is not managed and is not challenged and is instead fed, quietly and consistently, across 30 years of proximity and access and resentment that never found a name, until it becomes something that no longer has the texture of a feeling at all. It becomes a composition notebook with 43 pages of handwritten observations. It becomes a prepaid phone and a corner booth at 2 in the morning. It becomes a woman setting a coffee mug down carefully on a hallway table with bites because she does not want it to break. The mug belonging to the sister she put in the ground, being set down by the hands that put her there, in the house that was never hers, on the morning when the account finally came due. Rest in peace, Serena Carter Webb. You came into this world 11 minutes before your sister. You worked harder than you had to, and you loved more freely than you were required to, and you opened your door over and over to a woman who had been preparing to walk through it in a way you could not have imagined because you were not capable of imagining it. That incapacity was not your failure. It was your decency. You deserved better than what blood gave you, and the record knows it. Your mother made sure. If this story stayed with you, and I believe it did, I want to ask you one thing before you close this video. Drop your city in the comments below, because this story happened in Atlanta, and it involved a kitchen table on Danner Drive, and a burgundy front door in Buckhead, and a route through Southwest Atlanta on a Sunday morning in August. And we want to know who across this country is sitting with it tonight and thinking about the people in their own lives who they have been trusting without question. Drop your city. Tell us what you noticed. Tell us what you would have caught first. The hand, the name, the food that was almost right, or something smaller that none of us have mentioned yet. The comments are open, and we read every single one. And if the MindFrame Narratives is not yet part of your weekly routine, please kindly subscribe now. New story every week. Next week, a woman in South Memphis who spent 25 years raising her son alone, double shifts and sacrifice and everything she had, and found out at the end of those 25 years what her son had been doing with the life she gave him. You do not want to miss it. Subscribe so you are here when it drops. This is Blood Betrayer Story, where the truth about blood doesn't always run deep. Sometimes it just runs cold.